When we examine the catastrophic, world-shattering origins of the Second World War, we are almost exclusively taught a comfortable, highly simplified moral narrative. We are conditioned by decades of Hollywood films, high school textbooks, and political speeches to view the deadliest conflict in human history as a straightforward battle between absolute good and absolute evil. We are told that the war was caused simply by the sudden, inexplicable rise of charismatic, bloodthirsty dictators who hypnotized their populations with hateful, nationalistic ideologies. According to this deeply entrenched historical mythology, fascist leaders dragged a peaceful, unwilling world into apocalyptic destruction out of pure malice, racial hatred, and irrational ambition. This traditional, highly sanitized narrative is emotionally satisfying, politically convenient, and fundamentally, demonstrably false. The true origin of the Second World War is not a simplistic story of ideological madness or a sudden outbreak of collective human evil. It is a terrifying, deeply mathematical story of catastrophic economic collapse, brutal international trade wars, and a desperate, violent global struggle for finite natural resources. The Second World War was not fought primarily over clashing political philosophies. It was the ultimate, explosive climax of a completely broken global financial system. Today, we are going to completely dismantle the popular mythology surrounding the outbreak of the global conflict and expose the raw, unforgiving economic mechanics that made war an absolute, mathematical inevitability. We will show you exactly how the punitive financial architecture of the 1920s and the devastating trade wars of the 1930s trapped the world in a deadly corner. And we will demonstrate that the Axis powers did not launch their horrific wars of conquest simply to spread ideology, but to physically break out of a suffocating economic blockade that threatened their absolute survival. To understand the true, underlying causes of the Second World War, we must first return to the exact moment the First World War ended. In 1919, the victorious Allied powers gathered at the Palace of Versailles to dictate the terms of peace to a shattered, starving, and completely defeated German nation. The Treaty of Versailles is often criticized for being politically harsh, but its true, fatal flaw was that it was an absolute economic death sentence. The treaty deliberately and systematically stripped Germany of its most valuable, resource-rich territories, seizing 10% of its population and its most productive agricultural lands. It confiscated all of Germany's overseas colonies, seized its entire merchant marine fleet, and took direct control of the industrial Saarland and the coal-rich region of Upper Silesia. But the most devastating weapon deployed at Versailles was the imposition of astronomical, mathematically impossible financial reparations upon the German state. The Allies demanded that a nation entirely stripped of its wealth-generating resources somehow pay 132 billion gold marks to the victors. Leading economists of the era, most notably John Maynard Keynes, aggressively warned the Allied leaders that these punitive economic measures were physically impossible to fulfill. Keynes correctly predicted that forcing a modern, industrialized nation into perpetual, inescapable debt slavery would eventually trigger a massive, violent explosion that would destroy the entire European continent. But the politicians in Paris and London, driven by vengeance and their own crushing war debts to the United States, completely ignored the mathematical reality. They constructed a fragile, highly volatile global financial system built entirely on the impossible premise of extracting infinite wealth from a bankrupt nation. During the 1920s, this deeply flawed system was artificially propped up by a continuous, massive influx of private loans from Wall Street to the Weimar Republic. As long as American capital flowed across the Atlantic, Germany could pay its reparations to Britain and France, who could in turn pay their war debts back to the United States. But this incredibly fragile, highly leveraged international debt triangle completely evaporated in the crisp autumn of 1929. The catastrophic collapse of the American stock market instantly triggered a massive withdrawal of capital from Europe, paralyzing the global financial system overnight. Without American loans, Germany immediately defaulted on its reparations, causing the entire house of cards constructed at Versailles to violently collapse in on itself. As the financial panic rapidly metastasized into the Great Depression, the nations of the world made a series of incredibly selfish, deeply destructive economic decisions. Instead of cooperating to stabilize the international banking system, every major power panicked and violently retreated into absolute economic isolationism. The era of global free trade, which had brought unprecedented prosperity to the world before the First World War, was abruptly and permanently murdered. In 1930, the United States Congress passed the disastrous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, aggressively raising import duties on thousands of foreign goods to record historic levels. The United States government foolishly believed that by locking out foreign products, they could protect struggling American farmers and domestic factory workers from the global depression. But this highly protectionist measure triggered an immediate, devastating, and entirely predictable chain reaction of fierce international retaliation. Within months, every major industrialized nation on Earth had erected massive, impenetrable tariff walls, completely shutting down the flow of global commerce. Between 1929 and 1932, the total volume of international trade plummeted by an astonishing, catastrophic 66%. The world had abruptly descended into a brutal, unforgiving era of international trade wars, where nations aggressively sought to export their unemployment and poverty to their neighbors. Alongside these destructive tariff barriers, nations aggressively engaged in highly destructive currency wars, completely abandoning the stabilizing discipline of the international gold standard. Countries deliberately and competitively devalued their own paper currencies in a desperate, predatory attempt to make their exports cheaper and steal market share from their rivals. These beggar-thy-neighbor economic policies completely destroyed any remaining international trust, transforming the global economy into a ruthless, zero-sum battlefield. For massive, globally integrated empires like Great Britain and France, the collapse of international trade was painful, but it was not an immediate existential threat. The British Empire could simply retreat behind the walls of its vast colonial holdings, trading exclusively with India, Canada, and Australia in a closed, self-sufficient economic bloc. But for heavily industrialized nations that lacked vast overseas empires and domestic natural resources, the total collapse of global free trade was an absolute death sentence. This was the terrifying, inescapable economic reality facing the nations of Germany, Italy, and Japan in the early 1930s. These nations were highly industrialized, heavily populated, and absolutely dependent on importing food to feed their citizens and raw materials to run their factories. When the global markets closed and the tariff walls went up, these resource-poor nations suddenly found themselves completely locked out of the global economy. They could no longer export their manufactured goods to earn the foreign currency required to purchase vital imports of oil, rubber, iron ore, and wheat. The German people, who had already suffered through the apocalyptic trauma of hyperinflation in 1923, were now plunged into a brutal, deflationary depression. By 1932, German industrial production had collapsed by 50%, and over 6 million proud, desperate workers were roaming the freezing streets without any income or hope. It is in this specific, terrifying atmosphere of absolute economic starvation that the radical, extremist ideology of the Nazi Party found its fertile breeding ground. Adolf Hitler did not rise to power simply because the German people suddenly became hypnotized by anti-Semitic rhetoric or a desire for world domination. He rose to power because the democratic, capitalist system had completely, visibly, and catastrophically failed to provide the most basic economic security for the German population. Hitler offered a highly radical, incredibly seductive economic solution to a nation that felt it was being systematically strangled to death by the international community. He promised to permanently break Germany free from its absolute dependency on the hostile, unpredictable global financial markets that had destroyed the Weimar Republic. The core, fundamental driving force behind Nazi foreign policy was not just racial theory. It was a ruthless, deeply calculated economic concept known as autarky, or total national self-sufficiency. Hitler clearly understood that as long as Germany relied on importing food and oil from overseas, it would always be entirely at the mercy of the British Royal Navy. During the First World War, the British naval blockade had successfully starved hundreds of thousands of German civilians to death by cutting off overseas imports. The Nazi leadership was absolutely determined to ensure that Germany would never again be placed in a position where it could be starved into military submission by foreign powers. But autarky was a mathematical impossibility within the heavily restricted, geographically tiny borders imposed upon Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. To achieve absolute economic independence and feed a growing, industrialized population, Germany required massive, unprecedented amounts of physical territory. This was the true, underlying economic reality behind the infamous concept of Lebensraum, or living space, which is so often dismissed as purely ideological madness. Lebensraum was a highly calculated, ruthlessly pragmatic economic strategy to conquer and absorb the vast, resource-rich territories of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Germany did not look to the East simply out of ideological hatred for Bolshevism. It looked to the East because that was where the wheat, the coal, and the oil were physically located. The invasion of the Soviet Union was, at its very core, the largest, most violent armed robbery of natural resources in the entire history of human civilization. The Nazi war machine desperately needed the endless, fertile black soil of the Ukraine to permanently secure the German food supply and break the threat of blockades. And it absolutely required the massive, untapped oil fields of the Caucasus region to fuel its panzers, its battleships, and its rapidly expanding air force. The brutality of the Eastern Front was not just a clash of ideologies, it was a desperate, apocalyptic war of economic extermination, where millions were murdered simply to secure their land and resources. This exact same terrifying economic logic, driven by the absolute necessity of resource acquisition, was playing out simultaneously on the other side of the planet. The Empire of Japan was a rapidly industrializing, highly modern island nation that possessed virtually zero domestic natural resources. To maintain its booming economy and its status as a great power, Japan was almost entirely dependent on importing coal, iron, rubber, and overwhelmingly, oil. During the 1920s, Japan had successfully and peacefully integrated itself into the global free market economy, exporting massive amounts of silk and textiles to pay for its resource imports. But when the Great Depression struck and the Western powers aggressively raised their tariff walls, the Japanese export economy completely collapsed overnight. The United States heavily taxed Japanese silk, and the British and French empires strictly limited Japanese manufactured goods from entering their vast Asian colonies. Japan suddenly found itself completely isolated, unable to sell its goods, and consequently unable to purchase the vital raw materials its society desperately needed to function. Facing the absolute, terrifying prospect of total economic strangulation, the Japanese military leadership concluded that peaceful, international free trade was a failed experiment. They calculated that the only way to guarantee the survival of the Japanese empire was to physically carve out their own, exclusive, resource-rich economic empire in Asia. This was the true, fundamental motivation behind the aggressive Japanese invasion of resource-rich Manchuria in 1931 and the subsequent, brutal invasion of mainland China in 1937. The Japanese leadership called this vision the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was essentially a massive, closed economic bloc entirely controlled by Tokyo. They intended to forcibly expel Western imperial powers from Asia and directly monopolize the vast resources and massive consumer markets of the Pacific Rim. But this aggressive, violent expansion into China directly threatened the geopolitical interests and the lucrative colonial holdings of the United States and the British Empire. In response to Japanese aggression, the United States government began a systematic, escalating campaign of severe economic warfare against the island nation. The Roosevelt administration steadily tightened the economic noose, gradually cutting off Japanese access to international banking networks and critical industrial supplies. The ultimate, fatal turning point occurred in the summer of 1941, when the United States, alongside Britain and the Dutch government in exile, imposed a total, absolute embargo on Japan. They completely froze all Japanese financial assets located in the West and strictly banned the export of all aviation fuel, scrap metal, and crude oil to the Japanese Empire. This total economic embargo was not merely a diplomatic protest. For a resource-starved island nation like Japan, it was a terrifying, immediate death sentence. Without American oil, the Japanese economy would completely grind to a halt within months, and its powerful, modern navy would be reduced to useless, floating scrap metal. The Japanese high command was faced with a stark, brutal, and entirely mathematical choice: completely surrender their empire and retreat from China, or go to war to secure their own oil. Surrender was politically and culturally impossible, so the decision to launch a massive, preemptive military strike against the Western powers became an absolute, terrifying certainty. The infamous, shocking Japanese attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was not an act of irrational, spontaneous madness or unprovoked malice. It was a highly calculated, desperately executed military operation designed specifically to cripple the American Navy for just 6 months. The true, ultimate objective of the entire Japanese military campaign was not Hawaii. It was the vast, incredibly lucrative oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor solely to prevent the United States Navy from interfering, while Japanese forces seized the oil, rubber, and tin of Southeast Asia to save their collapsing economy. When we carefully analyze the true, underlying mechanics of these global events, the traditional, simplified narrative of the Second World War completely falls apart. The most destructive, catastrophic conflict in human history was not born in a vacuum of sudden, inexplicable human evil or purely ideological fanaticism. It was born in the austere, heavily shadowed boardrooms of central banks, in the halls of parliaments that passed destructive tariffs, and in the freezing, desperate breadlines of the Great Depression. It was the ultimate, inescapable, and highly violent consequence of a completely broken global financial system that had trapped entire nations in an economic death spiral. When the international community abandoned the stabilizing forces of free trade, sound money, and economic cooperation, they inadvertently guaranteed the outbreak of total war. By aggressively building massive tariff walls, launching predatory currency wars, and weaponizing access to vital natural resources, the victorious powers of the First World War created the perfect conditions for the Second. They forced industrialized, heavily populated nations into a terrifying corner where violent, aggressive military conquest appeared to be the only mathematically viable path to national survival. Understanding the true, economic origin of the Second World War is absolutely essential, because it forces us to confront the highly uncomfortable realities of our own modern geopolitical system. It completely strips away the comforting, romanticized illusions of ideological crusades and exposes the cold, raw, and unforgiving mechanics of resource dependency and international trade. It serves as a stark, permanent, and terrifying historical warning about the extreme dangers of utilizing economic warfare and trade isolation as primary instruments of foreign policy. When powerful nations systematically cut off their rivals from global markets, weaponize reserve currencies, and restrict access to vital energy resources, they are playing with apocalyptic fire. History definitively proves that when a sovereign nation is completely backed into a desperate economic corner and faces the total collapse of its living standards, it will not simply surrender. It will inevitably, violently, and aggressively strike out against the system that is suffocating it, regardless of the horrific human cost or the diplomatic consequences. The Second World War is the ultimate, tragic testament to the fact that economic isolationism and financial warfare do not prevent conflicts. They actively mathematically ensure them. And until we fully recognize that the roots of global conflict are almost always found in the ledgers of international trade, we remain completely blind to the true origins of war.